Now, and no one having done so, I will now call on Joe Fitzpatrick to move motion number 6235. Mr Fitzpatrick.
In moving, Presiding Officer, this revision comes to a revision from Business for this week, which was originally agreed on Tuesday, 26th of March, by the Parliamentary Bureau. However, following further discussions at this morning's Bureau, it is agreed to move the Green and Independent Party business from Wednesday to Thursday, and the Infrastructure and Capital Investment Committee from Thursday to Wednesday.
Thank you very much. I now put the question to the Chamber, and the question is that motion number 6235 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are. So we will now move to We'll now move to topical questions and call on question 1 from Sandra White.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government whether it will update legislation and guidance to ensure that ashes are always treated appropriately following cremation.
Minister Michael Matheson.
Presiding Officer, losing a loved one is a painful experience, and to grieve their loss means enduring the mix of joy and agony of remembering their life and living with their memory. When that loss is a child, the pain and grief is amplified at the futility of the passing of a life never fully lived. I believe that the recent cases of the treatment of ashes of very young children demonstrate that the existing legislation and current industry practice is falling short of what the public deserves. Today I can announce that I am establishing an independent commission to examine the policies and practices in place for handling ashes and cremated remains. The Commission will be tasked with producing recommendations before the end of this year to inform new legislation and guidance on cremation and burials. Central to the new legislation will be that it must ensure a consistent approach to the treatment of ashes across Scotland, and that families are treated sensitively and given the support and information they need.
Thank you. Sandra White.
I sincerely thank the Minister for that reply, and I'm sure the many people that's contacted me and others will sincerely thank him also, particularly that the legislation that underpins much of this is over 100 years old. Does the Minister also agree with me that local authorities like Glasgow must not shy away from the responsibility to investigate any case brought to them and give answers to parents? Will the Scottish Government also provide best practice guidance to local authorities on the conduct of their investigations, and will he ask that the NHS cooperate with any local investigations?
Minister.
Presiding Officer, I agree. I think it's important that local authorities and other owners of crematoria must be accountable for their historical practice, and they must respond to any complaints or concerns which are being raised by individuals or families, and they should duly investigate these complaints or concerns. I can also confirm to the member that as a government we will provide advice and information to local authorities around best practice in undertaking such investigations or any audits that may be required as a result of complaints that they may receive. And alongside that, I can also confirm to the member that the NHS will fully comply with any local investigation that is taking place.
Sandra White. You're okay. Thank you very much. Now call on Drew Smith.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I've been making representations on this issue to Glasgow City Council since being contacted by a constituent myself, and can I welcome the Minister's comments in terms of a commission to look at the legislative situation. I would agree that certainly each local authority does need to examine their practices and be clear that the information is being provided to individuals in local authority areas who have concerns. But does he share my view that part of the concern that people have relates to the fact that there are different practices that have been perhaps going on in different parts of the country, and that for that reason there is a national coordination needed on the investigation aspect of this, as well as in consideration of the legislative proposals that we need to see going forward?
Minister.
Well, I recognise the point that the member is raising, and in particular the issue around Glasgow and the recent case that was highlighted by my colleague Nicola Sturgeon on behalf of her constituent, who raised an issue of concern which I believe the Glasgow City Council should investigate. I think it would be fair to say, though, that Edinburgh City Council have set out a very good way in which that type of investigation can be undertaken independently to inform the Council of any issues that may have arisen through their practice. And I would encourage Glasgow City Council to reflect upon the measures that have been taken forward by Edinburgh City Council on the approach that they could take in investigating the particular case that has been highlighted by my colleague Nicola Sturgeon. And the further point the member made about the inconsistency in practice, and this is an issue which I have particular concern about, because I think it's important that families and have a consistency of approach around how ashes from the cremation process are handled for young children. And I am particularly anxious to make sure that the Commission is able to look at what practice has given rise to this inconsistency that's occurred across different local authority areas and also potentially private crematoria, but to make sure that they bring forward recommendations that allow us to put in place legislation and guidance that can ensure that we have a consistency of approach right across the country.
Thank you. Mark MacDonald.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome the Minister's response to my colleague Sandra White on the establishment of the Commission, and the Minister will be aware of concerns which have been raised around policies in place at Aberdeen Crematorium as well. The Minister will understand that this situation has led to parents of babies born asleep or those who have miscarried becoming confused and uncertain as to whether they themselves might have been entitled to receive ashes following cremation, and that such uncertainty has reopened grief for many. Would the Minister anticipate the Commission making clearer recommendations for situations where the return of ashes is not possible, which would provide clarity and in many cases closure for parents?
Minister.
I think that's one of the roles that the Commission will be able to take forward, is to make sure that there is a consistency in information that is provided to families at that particular point around whether ashes may be available or whether they are not available. I understand there are a number of technical issues that may give rise to whether ashes are available or not. However, it's important that families are informed of that at the very start of the process, so that it's a transparent process and one that they can have confidence in. And that's one of the roles that the Commission will have, is to explore the different practices and different policies that have been taken forward in different crematoria in the country in order to ensure there's a consistency of approach and also a consistency in information that's provided to parents at that time.
Thank you. Kezia Dugdale.
The Minister referenced the City of Edinburgh Council investigation as a good model of how things could work. Can I remind the Minister that that investigation is not properly underway yet? It cannot proceed until the police have concluded their investigations. I have 8 constituents whose lives are currently devastated by the revelations at Morton Hall. They want answers, they want justice, they want a public inquiry. Can I ask the Minister to comment on why he is not willing to give a public inquiry? Whilst I welcome the announcement he has made today, those parents will take some comfort in some sort of assurance from the Minister that their voices will be heard during that commission, and specifically that that commission will be able to call witnesses to it and that those people will be asked to give answers.
Minister.
Well, I think it's important to remember that the reason for Edinburgh City Council's investigation not to have been able to have taken the full range of evidence it would like to at this particular stage is because of the police investigation, and it's important that that due process is recognised because of the potential for evidence that could be used at a later stage should any criminal prosecutions take place. So it's important that that's recognised. What I do understand is that there has been preliminary work being undertaken by Dame Eilish Angelini and her team to look at some of the issues that they can establish at an early stage that do not impinge upon the police investigation, and that work has been taken forward by them. But I think it does provide a good model in terms of the independence of Dame Eilish Angelini in undertaking that investigation into the historical practices at Morton Hall, which could be used by other local authorities such as Glasgow City Council in considering issues of concern which have been raised by them. The purpose of the Commission, though, is to look at what practices and policies have given rise to this situation occurring in the first place, and to establish that, and then to look at what measures are necessary in order to ensure that it does not happen again, and that we have a consistency of approach being taken across all of our crematoria in Scotland, and alongside that, those within the NHS who may be involved in this process, and those within the funeral care industry as well. It's important we have a consistency of approach, and it will look at involving a number of individuals who can provide it with the support and advice that's necessary in taking that forward.
Briefly, Kezia Dugdale.
Thank you, President Officer. I welcome that answer, but the Minister didn't respond to the point about how he is going to ensure that parents' voices are heard in that process.
Minister.
Well, I have said to the member that it's my intention to have members on the Commission who can help to ensure that the process includes as many individuals as possible in actually considering what issues of practice need to be addressed with any future legislation. I will give consideration as to who can be on the Commission, who could represent parents and parents' interests when it comes to the point of appointing the Commission.
Many thanks. Now move to question 2. John Lamont.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what its response is to the report Shaping Scotland's Court Services.
Cabinet Secretary Kenny MacAskill.
I am considering the proposals and recommendations made in the report, but will make an announcement shortly.
John Lamont.
Well, I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that reply. He has been noticeably quiet since the publication of the Court Services plans. The SCS's report describes the closure of a fifth of Scotland's sheriff courts as proportionate, but I do wonder what the reaction would have been if a public body was to propose closing a fifth of our schools or a fifth of our hospitals. Does the Cabinet Secretary appreciate the value of local justice and local courts, particularly in areas like the Borders, and does he agree with 95% of those who responded to the consultation that the proposals would be deeply harmful to the quality of Scotland's justice system?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I do think that local justice is important, and this is a matter that has been given deep consideration by the Scottish Court Service under the leadership of the Lord President, our most senior judge. But we do face tough financial times. We do face significant cuts coming in from a Westminster government. I think I would have more sympathy for Mr Lamont if he wasn't to contrast it with the position south of the border, where 93 magistrates' courts have closed, 49 county courts have closed, and the importance in the English Borders has seen the closure of Alnwick, Penrith and Whitehaven. I think Mr Lamont should read that the Scottish Government and indeed the Scottish Court Service is doing what it can in the face of an austerity budget imposed upon us by a London Government, but who happily close courts in the English Borders and who close significantly more courts south of the border than the Lord President and the Scottish Court Service are considering north of the border.
John Lamont.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I am a member of the Scottish Parliament. The Minister is a member of the Scottish Government, and I would be grateful if he could restrict his remarks to dealing with the questions which I put to him and not try and answer on behalf of the UK Government. In recent months, there have been two related consultations. The Scottish Court Service consultation proposing the closure of several sheriff courts closed in December 2012. Yet in February 2013, the Scottish Government published a new courts reform bill which will transfer a significant number of civil cases from the Court of Session down to the remaining sheriff courts. Does the Cabinet Secretary share my concern that the Government's own proposals will simply add to the pressures on those sheriff courts which survive his closure plans?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, obviously I think the member makes an important point because there are two consultations ongoing, but let's remember that more than 94% of all civil cases are already heard in the sheriff courts. It's only a small minority that are heard in our higher courts, and therefore these matters have been fully factored into the situation considered by the Scottish Court Service. They do have to take cognizance both of the financial pressures that have to be dealt with by court services north and south of the border, whatever position Mr Lamont may take, but they also require to take account of reducing pressures upon the courts. And let's look, for example, at Duns. The number of summary trials in which evidence was led last year was 12. The number of ordinary proofs that proceeded was 0. There comes a time where the Scottish Court Service is not only to live within the budget that has been imposed upon it because of the cuts that come from Westminster, but has to take account of the volume of business, and when it is reducing, frankly, there comes a time where consolidation is necessary.
Okay, Rob Gibson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The consultation has shown considerable concerns indicated by my constituents in Sutherland and Ross-shire about the possible closure of the Dornoch and Dingwall Sheriff Courts. What actual provision can be made for the use of video conferencing in rural areas like the Highlands to compensate for greater travelling distances proposed in these court changes?
Cabinet Secretary.
I think the member makes an important point, and it is a matter that has been given appropriate and significant consideration by the Scottish Court Service and the Government. Under the Making Justice Work programme, work is nearing completion in the North that will see the introduction of a new, secure, live-link video conferencing network which includes 6 northern courts and 4 other locations. This work will be completed next month and will allow criminal justice organisations the opportunity to use the technology for some cases. And for the benefit of the member, the 6 locations are Aberdeen, Elgin, Inverness, Kirkwall, Lerwick and Stornoway.
Thank you. Claire Baker.
Proposing the closure of Cooper Sheriff Court, the report also states that jury trials will stop in Kirkcaldy. This will put significant pressure on victims and witnesses living in the Kirkcaldy and Glenrothes area, as well as increasing the probability of court delays and reducing access to local justice. What discussion has the Cabinet Secretary had with the Scottish Court Service on this proposal, which, unlike closures, will not require parliamentary approval? And does he share my concerns that removing jury trials from Kirkcaldy will impact negatively on witnesses and victims?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I have regular discussions with the Scottish Court Service, the Lord President and the Chief Executive. These matters have been factored in. It's not simply the matter raised by Mr Lamont in terms of some matters that are currently dealt with in the higher courts going to the Sheriff Court in civil matters, but clearly there are changes taking place in where sheriff and jury should be conducted and indeed in where the High Court should be carried out. And I think these matters have clearly been factored in. They have been taken account of, and indeed I think we should have some greater trust and faith in the Lord President and the Scottish Court Service.
Thank you. Alison McInnes.
Thank you very much. Can I ask the Minister to look carefully at the proposals for the court closure in Stonehaven? In particular, I believe he must address the cogent arguments put forward regarding the capacity of Aberdeen to absorb the extra work, especially when taken in conjunction with the High Court proposals. Nearly all the respondents commented that Aberdeen Sheriff Court already suffers from endemic delays. Surely the Minister agrees that further pressure added to that will make it very difficult. I ask him to reject the closure of Stonehaven.
Cabinet Secretary.
I think the member raises an important point, and clearly that's a matter that has to be factored in. It would be fair to say that the business conducted in Stonehaven is more than the business conducted in Duns, but for the record, in 2012 they had 34 trials at summary level that evidence was actually led in, and they had 4 proofs. I do think that that is perhaps not a number that would be incapable of being soaked up within Aberdeen, where there is greater specialisation. So these matters that I will reflect upon, but as I say, we do face significant financial challenges, and these have to be dealt with by the Scottish Court Service, as they are faced with by their counterparts south of the border. And equally, we have to recognise that there is less business going through our courts, even although some business is being reallocated, and the Scottish Court Service has to take that into account, given the complexity and specialisation of the legal world in which we now find ourselves.
Ian Gray, briefly, please.
Justice has been dispensed in the town of Haddington for hundreds of years. The SCS received 150 substantial submissions and thousands of pleas from East Lothian citizens that this continued, but SCS chose to ignore them. Will the Cabinet Secretary undertake to reconsider these submissions, to pay attention to the wishes of my constituents and remove Haddington from this hit list of closures?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, we do appear to be in ascending order here, and I will give cognisance to Mr Gray's position on Haddington, as I have given to John Lamont and to Alison McInnes. But for the record, the number of summary trials in which evidence was led and the trial proceeded in 2012 was 41. That is not even 1 a week. And the number of civil ordinary proofs which proceeded was 5. More than the seasons, but simply by 1. So I will take that into account, but we already have a position where many trials that would be scheduled for Haddington actually go to Edinburgh, especially those relating to children and other aspects such as sheriff and jury. So I will take into account those matters. But I think, having heard Jenny Mara, we have to have a position from Labour that appears to be that there can be no cuts made in the court budget. There can be no cuts made in the legal aid budget. And the only position the Labour Party has is that we should cut the number of police officers. I will be making it quite clear at the Scottish Police Federation conference tomorrow, we will not be cutting the number of police officers.
And finally and briefly, Lewis MacDonald, please.
Thank you very much. The Court Service's paper, of course, focuses on savings for the court service. Can the Cabinet Secretary tell us if he will also take into account in his consideration the impact of court closures as proposed on the local economy of county towns?
Well, yes, these are matters I will obviously discuss with Cabinet colleagues, but I can say to Mr Lewis MacDonald that both the First Minister, who normally stands here, and myself are people who grew up in Lithgow. When I first started practising law and indeed embarked upon a legal career, the county court for West Lothian was in Linlithgow. I have to say that Linlithgow has gone from strength to strength, notwithstanding the removal, quite understandably, to Livingston, because that is where the business is, a point that perhaps Mr Gray would take into account, given the overwhelming pressure in Haddington Sheriff Court from business that comes from Tranent, Musselburgh and Preston Pans, where it's easier, quicker in many instances to get to Edinburgh than it is to the old county